Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the lab. I'm your host, Lou Follenkamp, for today. But what we're going to do today, all right, is we're going to bring a new topic into the mist, and that is neuroplasticity in training. All right, so I'm hopefully here. I'm kind of break down some of the intersection between science and performance for you today. This is an absolute fascinating topic. I'm not going to do a huge deep dive today. If you want more on this, please let me know. I love this. This is fantastic. But you've probably not heard of neuroplasticity before. If you're in physical therapy school, you probably have. But it's basically, in a short definition for this, it's the brain's ability to adapt and change in response to its experiences. So, what does that necessarily mean for you as an athlete or if you're a coach, right, working with these kids? I would very much like to explore the how neuroplasticity affects skill acquisition, recovery, and especially in terms of risk reduction with injuries. So let's get into it. So if we're going to be talking about this, first let's get a little bit more of a definition to it. So at its core, neuroplasticity is just the brain's ability to rewire itself, right? In short, it happens every time you learn a new skill or you are learning a skill, adapting to a challenge, or even recovering from an injury. So this allows you to refine your motor skills, like trying to imagine how many times you're trying to perfect your squat, or improving your swimming stroke. That's why we practice. We're trying to clean up the mechanics of things. You're building new neural connections after an injury. So your body's kind of it's experienced that insult. So now you have to kind of retrain the body. Think of it as like when you've had either an ankle or a knee surgery and you try to balance on that leg for the first time and it feels completely wacky, right? It just doesn't feel the same. So you have to retrain in order to relearn balance. So your body's going through that whole relearning of motor patterns again, or relearning its awareness. So it can also help you to coordinate things in more highly cognitive required situations, right? So think about you're a wide receiver. You went through an ACL repair. You are going down the lines of your recovery, and you have to process where the safety is, where the corner is, you're how far deep on the field. You're maybe running a 10-yard out. You have to know that you don't want to have to think about your cutting mechanics while you're trying to run your route or think about what the defensive scheme is. So those are different things we want to kind of take into consideration when we're performing these types of recovery processes with our athletes. So if you can enhance their mental resilience to push through those types of high pressure situations where there's a lot of cognitive tasks, the mechanics themselves, you've worked through that, right? So why does it necessarily matter? So understanding neuroplasticity as a coach and as a physical therapist allows you to have the ability to help basically them train smarter, right? So it's not just about reps and sets, it's about how you teach the brain in order to optimize its performance or its mechanics. So let's start with a little bit of the science behind neuroplasticity. So, the brain adapts through two different main processes. So, we can look at it as structural plasticity, where this involves actual changes in the brain's anatomy. So, for example, when you're practicing a skill repeatedly, the neural pathways associated with that skill become stronger and more efficient. There's also functional plasticity. So, in regards to this, the brain's ability to reassign functions to different areas. So, it's critical in recovery for this aspect. Like when someone's trying to regain movement after an ACL repair, or relearn balance after an ankle repair, or an ankle sprain for that matter. So, these are influenced by a few different things. So, repetition. So, the more you practice, the stronger those neural connections will become. If you've never done something a day in your life, it's going to feel pretty wacky. You're not going to be like absolutely perfect at it the first time you ever try something. So it's like re-practicing the movement pattern over and over and over again until it becomes clean, it becomes finished. It's nice. And then also the intensity of which you practice this. So high effort practice basically accelerates adaptation. So like if you're not doing this at 100% speed and you're not pushing yourself to that level. So, like that wide receiver I was just talking about, if that wide receiver is always practicing that cutting route at, let's say, 50 or even, like, let's say 50 or 35% intensity or speed that they're supposed to be running, how am I basically going to expect them to run that at 100% and maintain the same like efficiency of those movement mechanics? And then last but not least is the rest and recovery aspect of things. So sleep and downtime are crucial for consolidating learning new skills. So if I'm not getting adequate sleep and my brain, my neurological processes are not able to recover, I might not pick up on those skills and those movement patterns as effectively as I possibly need to. So if you're that athlete who's listening to Netflix until 3 or 4 in the morning, this is for you. That might be something to start honing in on and improving. So if we want to do a little bit more on examples, right? So studies on athletics that show specific brain regions, right, like the motor cortex, grow denser actually with skill-focused training. That means that the brain is literally rewiring itself to become more efficient. How awesome is that? Like that is probably one of the coolest things ever, is that as you continue to hone in on that and you practice and practice and practice, it becomes much more ingrained in you and it'll become cleaner, more efficient, not necessarily perfect, but closer, getting closer. So now let's see how we can apply this to your training. So it's the foundation for skill acquisition, like I think we've kind of touched on already in the past. But when you're learning a new movement, right, or you're trying to refine that technique, your brain is building and strengthening the neural pathways, like I said before. All right. So how can we start improving this, right? So here's a few little tips that you can actually start using this to optimize your skill acquisition. Number one, like we talked about, repetitions, right? Deliberate practice. So if you want to focus on quality over quantity, it's better to try to perfect a certain amount of repetitions, or not, I shouldn't even say perfect. Make those repetitions more efficient and drive in that pattern instead of giving me 50 really crappy repetitions where it's not the most efficient pattern. Two would be varying the environment of which you're performing said repetitions. So if you're always practicing in the clinic and you have that person working on the cutting drills, or you're having them working on like a counter movement jump where they land and then they got to get off the ground again, you might learn that type of setting where it's quiet, it's isolated, it's controlled. You might need to get them out on a basketball court. Funny thing to think about, actually getting them into the setting where they need to be, in order to start simulating those types of game-like situations or practice situations so that they can become accustomed to the environment, the feel, the noise, the visual, like getting them as much towards that simulated gameplay or whatever aspect they want to do if it's not athletics. Like getting in and out of a car, for example. If you're working on just doing a sit to stand and you're always using the bedside table or a chair, maybe you need to go out to the car with them and watch how they get in and out of the car, for another example. But then also the type of feedback you're providing to them. If you're giving them immediate feedback, whether if it's through like verbal cueing or you're using a video, so like I like to record some of my athletes when they're moving and kind of break down their form with them. It also helps with them learning how to correct errors, and then they can also reinforce the patterns that you do want. So that's something that's very beneficial. Obviously, get permission on recording them if you're going to be doing that beforehand. But that type of analysis sometimes can be a very eye-opening experience for them as well. So, part three, right? So, neuroplasticity and recovery. So, this can be, and I'm talking about like post-surgical, right? So, this can be very, or maybe not even post-surgical. This could be anyone in any aspect of recovery. I don't want to just pigeonhole this, but the brain will learn to compensate for its lost function. So it's like we kind of make do with what we have, right? So we will try to accomplish the task in the easiest and least painful way possible. So our body will do like a self-preservation priority with that. So some things that we want to start working on in terms of taking them through this recovery process and kind of getting away from those bad patterns, we want to start putting them through what a good pattern might look like, right? So, in terms of like starting this off, maybe I'll have them watch a video and watch them, or maybe even watch me do the movement so they can see, like, oh, this isn't going to be as painful as I thought, or it's not as dangerous or as precarious as they might perceive it to be. So, visualization. So, mental imagery can activate some of the same neural pathways as actual physical practice. So this could be even watching a video. I know I've heard of Olympic weightlifters watching the snatch or going through and closing their eyes and visualizing themselves performing particular lifts prior to going out on the stage and performing that lift. It helps with exciting the neural pathways. Can also help with isolating themselves in that moment and getting them ready to go. I know like when I tore my pec and I was working through like how am I going to perform a bench press or an overhead press with my right arm? I actually would visualize going through a bench press mechanic and kind of think about where's my elbow going to be going, where's my scapula going to be retracted, all of those things. And then also part two of this is I want you guys to start thinking about like a progressive way for this. So once they kind of become accustomed to a certain stimulus, we want to start changing that, making it more difficult to gradually reinforce those types of patterns to further enhance those neural connections, but then also taking that and getting as close towards game simulation or activity simulation as possible. Right now, we could get into a few different aspects of that if we ever wanted to dive deeper. But the other thing would be cross education. So if for some reason you can't immediately move the affected area, so like when I was in my sling for about the first 6 weeks, I wasn't able to do any lifting or training with my right arm, but I did perform some of those lifts with my left. So like that cross education, I'm training the uninjured side in order to stimulate those areas of my brain for neuroplastic changes that could also then down the road help me with my injured side. So something to take into consideration if you're immobilized at that limb for the time being, practice what you need to be doing or you want to be doing on the uninjured limb so you can make benefits neurologically there as well. Practice makes perfect, right? So think about like a ACL, right? I know everyone uses the ACL as the example. It's one of the easiest things that comes to mind when we're doing this. But what happens is that if you can start including single leg exercises for the uninjured leg, and then eventually go down the road to when once it's safe, you can begin doing that on the other side. It might not feel as foreign to them. Now, obviously, they're going to take into consideration the weakness, maybe even a little bit of discomfort if they first start it compared to the uninjured side, but then that's when you can start using it as a compare and contrast as you start making progress. So finally, let's start talking about mental resilience. I hope you guys have the opportunity to eventually, depending on when this comes out, listen and see one of my talks with the Grind podcast, which was so much fun. So thank you, Zach, for that. Um, but neuroplasticity is not just physical, it can be mental as well. So here's a few ways that you can start training your mental resilience using neuroplasticity or facilitating neuroplasticity. So number one would be mindfulness and meditation. So these practices can help with rewiring the brain. It kind of goes along with that visualization aspect of things, but it can also help you to reduce the stress that you're undergoing, and you can start kind of putting yourself in the mind, like the frame of mind of progress. And I need to be aware of this is what I want to be able to do. I want to visualize this movement, and I'm going to move forward with it. Two is just positive self-talk, right? So if you're always thinking about negatively on the situation, progress is going to be very hard to come by. If you can start replacing those negative thoughts with positive affirmations, you can actually strengthen those neural pathways as well, improving confidence in the movement, as opposed to having apprehension or fear of performing said movements. And then the other thing to take into consideration is just exposure to the movement and towards the stress, right? So if you're trying to put yourself in a high stakes situation immediately and you are setting yourself up for failure. So it needs to be a gradual exposure to high pressure situations like mock competitions, or mock situations in the positions that you might be. Like think about that wide receiver I just talked about, or getting in out of the car. Not necessarily a high stakes situation, but maybe you got to go to the bathroom. I don't know. Never know. But those can help with the brain's adaptation and regulation of stress. So those are all things we want to take into consideration. Um, so I know I talk about elite athletes a lot, or I talk about most of my kiddos. But if you could start practicing that mindfulness, you can also help with the prefrontal cortex in the area responsible for focus and decision making while under pressure, which is huge in athletics. Huge. Think about like when so we were just at the University of Dayton basketball game, and some of these guys are. I mean, they see some of the, I mean, the opposing players when they're having to face the Red Scare and they're performing their free throws, they have nothing but madness going on behind that backboard. So, how on earth are you ever going to replicate that in the practice setting when you have over, I mean, the Red Scare is huge now behind the backboard. They are going absolutely crazy. It's so fun to watch. I miss it. I'm not gonna lie, I miss sitting back there. But that's something to take in consideration when you're trying to get someone back to athletics. So to wrap up, neuroplasticity is a game changer in training, recovery, and then also just overall performance. So if you didn't take anything away from me, I'm gonna break it down for you real quick at the very last minute. All right. So number one, neuroplasticity allows the brain to adapt and improve through repetition, intensity, and rest. That's a big important part of that. Two, skill acquisition relies on deliberate practice, varied environments, and also feedback. How frequent's the feedback? How much are you going to provide feedback wise? Visual feedback? Those all matter. Number three, in recovery, techniques like visualization and cross education leverage a lot of neuroplasticity to accelerate progress, especially in those of you who can't necessarily move their limbs immediately. But maybe once you start getting into the realms of practicing with the injured limb, you already have set the foundations for that neurologically, or at least some form. And then number four, mental resilience. If you can start being more mindful of how you are approaching your rehab process or your training, and you can frame things in more of a positive self-talk and gradually exposing yourself to stress, you can make benefits and strides in that regards as well. But I hope that you all have enjoyed this small little snippet on neuroplasticity and training. Thank you so much for joining me on the lab. I hope this information is beneficial to some of you. I hope you share it with some of maybe your coaches, your athletes at your training, or maybe even your teammate. But don't forget to subscribe, please, so that you don't ever miss an episode when we eventually get everyone back together. Right now, life is busy, but life is good. So, I mean, right now it's just me for these few episodes, but don't worry, Brandon, Alex, and Dave will be back, and we've got a line of interviews hopefully on the way as well. But thank you so much. I will see you next time. Keep training smart and adapting well. Have a good one, guys.